Okay, you guys are good to go. As long as you unmute yourself. They are. You are currently live. You'll have to unmute yourself. One second. Well, that will be fixed in just 1 second. All right. And there you go. Just a few seconds, and you will be on the picture. You see it? You don't see it. Well, there you go. Yep, you're on there. So you can feel free to go ahead and start whenever you're ready. Anna, you're still muted. Anna, you're still muted.
From compact or interact?
I can.
No.
Am I?
Yes. What do you
That is my opinion. That's fair.
Okay. I got diverted into this journal.
Yes, right.
And you are invited.
I never practiced. Crazy.
I love those classes. They were rare, but I grew up. That's pretty big of yourself.
Well, like, why do you write so I so.
Definitely, I mean, like even just that.
You said something. Oh, I said. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, I had a couple of I'll be president and not the
Well, I'm in. But if it was. Yes. Okay. That's why you're wearing it. It's being technically married. Well, when I first went to the city, I was just. Columbia went out. I'm student housing. Under a program. I think it's official. It's not like the same. Yeah. Never saw like it's not graduate. Like 4 other guys, you know, each had weird. They were all. I think that was a selective thing they saw in Iran. No, this is that. Yeah, this no, I had a girlfriend whose job was recommendation would be. Oh, interesting. To make sure there was like other. Yeah, that was the mid 2000s. I wouldn't put it past. I'm Jesse. You have your.
Yes, yeah. Do come in closer so we can hear you and see you. And if you want.
Oh, we got a bunch of grass. Thank you very much. Yeah. The richness of the action.
Yeah. Hi.
Starting?
Yeah, let's start.
All right.
You're all on Twitter, by the way.
Retweet this.
Did I say something?
Yeah.
So, welcome everybody. This is our first Inter-Intellect X Compact magazine reading group event. I think this kind of came out of me just loving a lot of your articles, philosophical deep dives, and we felt that these articles really merit a live discussion. Not that we don't like just rage commenting on various social media posts, but there is something about coming together and having a patient, open, multidisciplinary conversation. And so we thought, let's start with something small and not controversial at all, like Michel Foucault, right? And his effects on American politics and the American psyche. So here we are. The water bottles are slightly delayed, but they are on the way. So as we get more and more heated, in this conversation, there will be more hydration, I promise. And welcome, Geoff and Sohrab. This is a dream come true. Thank you for being here. And let's dive in.
All right. So I will start and just say we published a number of things earlier this year, and including podcasts and articles that had to do with Foucault, in part because I had been working on him in a few areas, which I may get into, but also because it happened to be the 40th anniversary of his death, which you know, it was an occasion that I thought was like, it was sort of less observed and marked than I expected, perhaps.
There are
given
other
his-
religious holidays.
Yeah, exactly. Another so then, you know, given his almost saintly status and the you know, much of American academia, which, you know, kind of went along with this odd way that I you know, while he remains very, you know, notable and, you know, widely cited, there is some way that his status as, you know, low-key fell off or whatever. Like he has undergone a sort of strange transformation, which is maybe subtle, but I think significant. And I will, you know, slightly, I won't take credit for it, but I'll take credit for being one of the first people who observed it, and the other person who almost simultaneously did was the writer Bleak Smith, and this was during the pandemic. And I think both of us, having encountered quite a bit of Foucault, as well as various people who kind of worked with and from his ideas, like Giorgio Agamben, in the, you know, earlier part of the 21st century, when both of us were in graduate school, realized that, you know, it was very weird to observe the debates that were happening around public health in 2020, 21. And so I wrote a long piece about this for American Affairs, I believe in the winter, in the, you know, late 2020, that, you know, kind of covered at length his legacy, but kind of specific, and it was called How We Forgot Foucault. It was tied to the famous polemic against Foucault by his rival Jean Baudrillard, who wrote a book called Forget Foucault. And so I argued, you know, in a sense, he was kind of forgotten and strangely sort of orphaned by the academic establishment that he, in some way, you know, had become the patron saint of, speaking of religious holidays in many ways, and was very much, you know, kind of revered and, you know, treated as almost kind of gospel truth for, you know, certainly the time I was in graduate school, but had sort of strangely become disconnected from the the academic politics of that period, which were very much about you know, the idea that we needed to empower the state to, you know, engage in this kind of often quite authoritarian seeming project of sort of the protection of life. In other words, biopolitics. And so anyway, I wrote this piece, and then it was picked up by Ross Douthat in the New York Times, and Ross wrote an article called How Foucault Lost the Left and Won the Right. And I think it was maybe less true that the right at that time was directly kind of recovering Foucault, although I would say when I wrote about it, I mean, I wrote for Right of Center journal, American Affairs, and certainly, you know, got subsequent solicitations from other Right of Center publications to write about this kind of set of issues. But certainly Agamben, who, you know, in some ways kind of, when I was in graduate school, was the lodestar for sort of thinking about biopolitics and security, you know, the security state.
Right,
and things
you
like
have
that.
the whole like fingerprint thing.
Yes,
You
yeah.
never come to the US, right? Because
Right,
after
exactly.
9/11,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. So he
He's lost.
and so, you know, he was an early, of course, you know, Foucault, having died 40 years ago, wasn't around for COVID, but Agamben, who was very much, you know, pursuing his lines of thought about biopolitics, you know, was one of the, I mean, I think probably the earliest intellectual critic of the COVID sort of lockdown regime, and, you know, was essentially sort of excommunicated by much of the academic left for this, and at the same time was taken up by figures on the right. And so Agamben was, you know, for example, also in the New York Times, Christopher Caldwell, you know, a notable conservative journalist, wrote a piece about Agamben's critique of the COVID regime. And so, that there was this kind of picking up of this strain of particular kind of critique of power and the power of experts, and the intersection of sort of scientific knowledge and power in the state that clearly kind of came out of, or in some cases, sort of conservatives like accidentally touched on themes without necessarily knowing it that come out of Foucault, which is interesting, of course, because Foucault is still often seen as sort of and as Ross Douthat put it in his piece, is seen as kind of a satanic figure for the right. He's seen as a sort of super spreader, and this is interestingly tied to his, these kind of legends that sprung up after his death from AIDS, which if you read James Miller's biography of Foucault, it sort of begins and ends with this legend that was widely circulated that he had sort of deliberately spread the AIDS virus, right? And that he had kind of deliberately infected other sexual partners, knowing that, and this isn't, Miller concludes that this isn't true, that it's sort of an urban legend, but that it has a kind of relation, I think, to the way that he's seen as a super spreader of ideas, right? He's seen as a vector of intellectual plague by the right, and specifically ideas about sexuality, gender, and so on. And so, the fact that on one hand, there are certain aspects of his insights that could kind of start to be appreciated by the right in this period, even as, and going back to this point about how he's kind of demonized, has all these narratives attached to him that kind of make him again into this sort of dangerous seducer kind of figure, is that there was a strange statement by a French intellectual named Guy Sormont in around the same time, like I believe 2021 or so, claiming that Foucault had sort of frequented underage male prostitutes while living in Tunisia in the late 60s.
Like that.
And what's that?
But did the same,
Yes,
right?
but-
Just in Morocco.
But so this may or may not be true, it's unclear, but there was no actual evidence of this beyond Filmon's claim about it, but it did circulate very widely on the right in
That's
this
interesting,
period.
right? Because Bact writes about it in his own journals, so we have proof. Maybe
Yeah,
somebody has read the name.
Certainly Foucault, Sormont claimed that he had literally seen this happen. He claimed he went to Tunisia, he saw Foucault pick up this 15-year-old boy and whatever, go out back with him. But Sormont, conservative French intellectual, not really a sort of friendly to Foucault intellectually, so it's not necessarily the most reliable statement, but it did kind of gain traction because it was part of this kind of larger kind of demonology that surrounds Foucault on the right. And so, these were just some things that have been of interest to me for several years. And then, the most recent thing I worked on, which is going to come out in a book in the next year or so, that's actually about a book about René Girard, a sort of contemporary of Foucault, who's not usually kind of brought into dialogue or connection with him, but it turns out they did have some kind of fascinating interactions in the early 70s, which were not really known about until this new biography of Girard came out late last year. And so I sort of, starting from there, explore this kind of parallel trajectory of the two of them during the 70s, and was working on this paper in the spring. So I thought, it would be good to do some podcasts, get some articles. So just to mark this 40th anniversary. So, at that point, I guess in our discussions in the editorial team, Sohrab was interested in exploring some aspects of Foucault that I believe had initially come out of his kind of study of neoliberalism as an economic phenomenon, but then has sort of since then, expanded into another project, or a kind of broader project that I think kind of takes it in a somewhat different direction and focuses on different aspects of Foucault. So I suppose at this point I'll pass it over to Sohrab, and he can just explain kind of the piece he wrote earlier this year, and then how it connects to this kind of larger project that he's working on.
Yeah, thank you, Geoff. So I normally give very, what I describe as well manicured speeches, you know, where it's already written and but
That's why we invited you.
I'm not gonna do that here just because as Geoff kind of alluded to, I'm in the early stages of a book project that I just announced. And it's a book, the tentative title, which is The Triumph of Normal. And it's in part a critique and in part a defense of this much contested idea of normal, which of course is very, very important for Foucault. But so this summer, as the 40th anniversary was approaching of Foucault's death, I wanted to write an essay for Compact, which was shared as part of the introductory material for this salon, and it was mainly inspired by Foucault's meditations on neoliberalism, which come in his 1978-79 lectures at the Collège de France called The Birth of Biopolitics, which, by the way, almost the entirety of the lecture is not about biopolitics. He's like just completely digressive, and then one session is really devoted to biopolitics, and it's, I think, one of the most sort of prescient documents in terms of describing the world that we have inhabited for the past few decades, and perhaps the world to come in the coming decades. And the funny thing is, if you read the printed lecture, it's the shortest one in the Birth of Biopolitics printed version, and it says in a footnote something like, you know, Professor Foucault had to cut this one short because he had a meeting. Whatever the meeting was, who knows? But it's remarkable because, you know, we're now used to thinking of neoliberalism as a political economic order, and also actually more likely as a kind of pejorative catch-all term, like kind of like fascist or whatever. It can mean any number of things to political antagonists, you know, flinging neoliberal at each other as a term of insult. But in 1978-79, this was really novel, and you know, Foucault had this profound insight summed up in one sentence in that lecture, which I used that lecture quite a bit in my previous book, which is on political economy, titled Tyranny, Inc. And I approached first that lecture via the political theorist Wendy Brown, who's done a lot of work on Foucault's thinking on neoliberalism. But he basically says something like, you know, classical liberalism just wanted the state state and society to leave the market alone, right? This is the story you can also get from someone like Karl Polanyi about the rise of the autonomous market, of a market society that has to make everything work around the demands of the market. But then Foucault says that was classical liberalism, but neoliberalism governs society by the market. That is what it means for governance, and what it means to really run a good society has to meet market metrics and market demands. And then he goes on and he hints at what may come later. He says, well, if that's the case, what neoliberalism does is it erases the class distinctions that even classical liberalism recognized, certainly Marxism recognized, certainly the social and Christian democratic recognized, and it conceives of each person as an individual human capital whose goal in life is to valorize itself in the same way that any capital does in classical Marxist theory. And he says, if that's the case, then in the 21st, well, he doesn't say in the 21st century, but in the future, we'll come to a world in which the kind of children that you have will be of paramount importance. If you want to valorize yourself as capital and project yourself in the future, you will be very concerned with the sort of biological capacities of the child, of its IQ, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, you know, that could have eugenic, including racially eugenic, dark, sinister components to it. So that's what I wanted to come in at. But then, you know, I in order to fill out the essay with more than just a commentary on how prescient that was, I began reading the wider Chaldean corpus, and I'd read quite a bit, and I was like a Trotskyist in college, and after a while I got bored with the sort of classical Marxist canon. So of course you go to the other parts of the theory section of the university bookstore, and among others, I picked up Foucault, but I was not really, I don't know, Foucault didn't grab me. I was much more into, at that point, like Lacan. And Foucault seemed to me like he was sold as a philosopher, but when you actually read him, he's very rarely doing what you would recognize as philosophy. It looks more like, it looks like a kind of combination of history or sociology, any number of things that you don't, where it's a bit different than whereas Lacan, the psychoanalyst, even though it's very clearly like lecturing to clinicians and stuff, has these very clearly philosophical insights.
But then you realize there's this beautiful moment in your essay where you basically realize that what Foucault is doing is Aristotelian first principles kicking, right? Because you kind of like hone in on it and realize
Sort
that
of,
he's
yeah.
investigating these universals by
Denying their
positing that they exist,
that
that
they don't
they
exist,
don't
yeah.
exist. And
So-
that's kind of a breakthrough for you in understanding. what
Yeah,
is
yeah, and how he's useful, how he's really just an unbelievably useful thinker. So, to fast forward, basically, I in my reading of Foucault, I came across this concept over and over, most notably in this lecture from 74-75, which is called Abnormal, of normality as a normality and normalization, and as a distinctly kind of early modern concern. A society that is industrial will demand a kind of standardized people that it can deal with, and normality becomes very important for trying to govern populations and so on. And so that led me to try to write this book, which is in its early stages now. So, but basically, Foucault accesses normality through his great mentor, who was both a philosopher and a physician named Georges Canguilhem, and who wrote a book called The Normal and the Pathological, enormously influential in the philosophy of medicine, in terms of trying to think about what is the normal state of an organism and what is the abnormal or pathological state. And it's actually a profoundly complicated question. It goes back to the 19th century and the rise of sort of statistics as a discipline of not just a discipline, actually, but epistemology of trying to understand a world that is heavily enumerated. The historian of ideas, Ian Hacking, calls this the avalanche of numbers that took over the world in the 19th century. And so the overriding question for me is, okay, is normal useful for someone like me? In our time, when people constantly talk about where there's this sense that normality is under threat, especially in the kind of pandemic and post-pandemic era, did we lose normality? Did some new normality get imposed on us? Or was it actually remarkably, it was actually remarkable, the alacrity with which we actually restored the status quo ante of normality. And then more broadly, if you are someone like me, I'm a Catholic and I have a certain kind of more natural law and Aristotelian commitments, what can you do with normal? And so what I'll try to explore in the book is first to go into this intellectual history and point out that normal actually has two valences. And this is, Hacking recognizes this, Canguilhem recognizes this, and that's this. There's on the one hand, normal as a statistical category, and it's basically, anytime you sort of mass measure people, one of the earliest and most influential studies is, of course, like Durkheim on suicide, behavior of people, or early workers' compensation policies, like how long will people live? The scholars had to go back and try to measure what they call the quantum of sickness. How likely are people how long are people likely to live, or how likely are they to tap into workmen's compensation funds, very early mutual aid, et cetera. And any of those studies yields a kind of, a bell curve and a kind of bell curve distribution. And in that sense to say, okay, well, normality has an enduring meaning, which is the title of my book, or at least a tenth of the title, is actually a tautology. Whenever you say the triumph of normal, it's not that normal as this thing fought through and came out on top. There will always be some distribution of beta, and there'll be always the kind of middle frequency where it's like that's where most of the people will land, and then you'll have the sort of extremities on both sides of the bell curve. There's that sense of a normal, okay, that's valence one. But the second one is actually in the etymology of the word, and it's a good question. So normal, the Roman root is norma, which has to do with a right angle. And I wonder if anyone knows what the Greek equivalent of norma is. Ortho, very good. Yes, right. So it has a kind of it has a kind of value-laden aspect of what could be or what should be the normal end of a human life. And for Foucault, as you read in that essay, that was a kind of polemical concept. It was an oppressive concept. Whenever you hear the word normalization, or whenever you encounter the word normalization in Foucault, it's the one thing that he's like really fired up about and dislikes. But you know, for someone like me, potentially normal might be a way back to natural law, or normal might be a way back to Aristotelian virtue ethics after the sort of the things that happened in the Enlightenment, most notably the rupture between is and ought, you know, the fact value distinction introduced by Hume. Since that sort of has made metaphysics hard for a lot of people, it's possible to think that normal might be a kind of a way in which through which you can sneak in something like natural law or virtue ethics, you know, by reference to this is what the norm of a human organism is or should be. So that's the project as where I am right now, and it's very loosey-goosey yet, but might be good enough to get us going for a discussion.
Do you think that the fact that Foucault came from this very bougie countryside doctor family, the same exact family structure, by the way, that Emmanuel Macron, they had the same family. Does it have to do something with just this gigantic revolting against the seeking of normalcy?
I'll turn that to
Well,
Geoff, who's a better student of his life.
I mean, I don't know. It also immediately makes me think of the École Normale Supérieure, right, which is tied to the education system.
3 big words there.
But which is also, I mean, it's funny. I think like when I first heard this, and other people think of it, they're like, that's a really weird concept because how can it be both normal and superior? But I mean, as I understand it, it sort of has to do with the educational system and its role in kind of imparting in normalizing or imparting norms across society, right? Because it's essentially a teacher training institution. And so anyway, I mean, yeah, I think he comes from this sort of provincial, sort of perfect provincial bourgeois French environment.
The postcard. He comes from the postcard.
From Poitiers, very picturesque city, and then he is sort of somebody who feels himself, and his father is a doctor, which is significant, obviously, as far as his long emphasis on medicine as a form of power, right? As a means by which power is exercised. And so I think, he clearly is somebody who, and he doesn't, the biographical details are getting a little hazy. I think he's both recognized as extremely gifted, but I think he does struggle with his exams at certain points and like doesn't quite make it the first time into the ENS and then has to do them again or something. So, it's this very, it is the story of how he is kind of elevated by the system. He becomes, he is brought into the company of these important French intellectuals during his time there. And then he interestingly goes and spends time in Sweden, Poland, and Tunisia, I believe, and I think Germany as well, Hamburg. And so he's kind of in this role, interestingly, of like a, essentially a kind of French, a sort of representative of French civilization to these places. And so, he's part of this kind of civilizing mission of the French state in his role in these institutions. And so he is kind of this, he's very much this kind of institutional insider who's part of these, various kind of elite institutions central to French culture, but he at the same time is sort of, is a critic, his entire kind of corpus is a critique of institutions, which, nonetheless, he's very much part of. I mean, I'm just kind of rambling here anecdotally, but I mean, the other thing that really, the part of his biography is.
From inside, right?
Yeah, I mean, and then, he ends up at the Collège de France, which is basically, as elite as it gets. And, at a relatively young age too, but, before that, he has this period in the new University of Paris campus that's created in the wake of the '68 revolt, which is a fascinating episode. I mean, perhaps in terms of a kind of project of normalization or of an attempt to revert to some kind of normal after the exceptional moment of '68, which is, very explicitly the French government is trying to think, what do we do about these students? How do we deal with them? And so they're like, well, we'll create this campus where we'll encourage all this really radical stuff that they're into, and we'll bring all the bigwigs of this, the most kind of radical thought, including Foucault. We'll make them professors there, and then we'll just kind of let them, I mean, I think they literally are sort of, there are phrases used by people in the government that are sort of putting them out to pasture, basically. So this Vincennes campus is created. Foucault is made the chair of the philosophy department. He recruits a number of other major people there, but then, when he's teaching there, it's like, he's not radical enough, the students don't see him as radical enough. It's incredible to read the descriptions of what happened at this campus. I mean, basically, it's like any teacher's nightmare. The students are just constantly like hectoring and harassing the professors and like denouncing the, it's whatever people fear about like the woke campus, but on steroids. It's like they're just constantly being like denounced for ideological heresies and deviations by the students. The students are meanwhile in all kinds of ideological wars with each other. They're like setting up barricades like inside the campus using desks and so he's basically part of this, and he's trying to run a philosophy department and get these kind of notables. And so he spends a couple of years there, and it's seemingly a complete nightmare. And interestingly, he's not politically. It actually takes him a little while to get really involved in the political radicalism. He sort of does, and he does have a period of kind of being quite friendly with these these really sort of fire-breathing Maoist students. And this is also an interesting part of his career, because I would say, like Sartre in this period, he's actually sort of radicalized or re-radicalized by the students, which is not what we're supposed to think about how this works, right? We're supposed to think, I mean, if we're, I guess, coming at it from this sort of culturally conservative critique, we're supposed to think, oh, these guys were, these radicals who were, whatever, tenured radicals, like poisoning the minds of the youth. But in a way, it's like these guys who were actually, I mean, Foucault was like not necessarily seen as particularly politically active or anything, but he was kind of radicalized gradually by, even though I think he found it frustrating to be surrounded by these kind of lunatic students who just like derailed all of his classes. He was kind of ultimately radicalized by them for a while. And he did, in a sense, kind of try to, if you read the very first interview in the volume Power Knowledge, it's like his dialogue with these Maoist firebrands of this period. And I write about it in this piece about Foucault and Girard because it's completely fascinating. But basically they're talking about like, okay, well, if we can't trust the justice system, which is just the tool of bourgeois rule, like what do we do? Well, I guess we just basically lynch capitalists, and so it's pretty out there stuff. So he does interestingly kind of get drawn into these projects, despite again having this role as a very elite and prestigious figure, and then of course he's brought into the Collège de France, I think when his first lectures are what, 71, 72. Yeah, so he's brought in, you know, within a few years of them, he doesn't spend that long at the new kind of experimental Paris campus. So yeah, I mean, he's an interesting figure, and I think, you know, maybe something the conservative kind of critics get right is like he does kind of mark this new type of academic, right? Who's both a kind of insider to the most elite parts of the system, but at the same time is kind of, you know, framing himself as a rebel and a radical,
Yeah.
to varying degrees across his career, and
Whereas-
participating in these
Whereas
kind of,
like
protests
Adorno
and
was
direct action.
immediately annoyed by the,
right,
he just was like, what are you doing? I wanna
Yeah.
teach, you
Right.
know, or there's footage you can find on YouTube of Lacan, like one of his
Yeah.
seminars being harangued by a 68er, being like, but sir, aren't you a blah, blah, blah," and he's just like.
But it does matter, right? I mean, you know, not to get too Freudian here, but, you know, growing up in the normal, like other people's dream normal, and seeing it from the inside, that in some sense, that is what will make you a credible critique, like a credible critic. And I think this is something where we might be a little bit unfair with our contemporaries. Like, yeah, of course, this professor, whoever comes from the middle class, but maybe that's why they know what they're talking about. In the Foucauldian era, we were a little bit more forgiving.
yeah, sure. I mean, I think, you know, he is somebody who, I don't think he doesn't sort of, I mean, it's interesting, like he doesn't try to disavow his sort of elite status. I mean, I think, you know, the fact of his homosexuality, you know, is significant here, especially if we consider, you know, that even at the peak of sort of radicalism in this period, it wasn't necessarily yet taken to be a kind of frontier of political action. I mean, and also it's interesting in relation to his relation to the left and sort of the establishment left, because he spends some time in Poland. There's an interesting book about this by a Polish journalist, came out a couple of years ago, but you know, he spends some time in Poland and is, you know, I mean, it's a, you know, he comes into contact with the gay community in Warsaw and, you know, has a couple of relationships, but, you know, it's extremely repressed, you know, it's extremely suppressed and by the state, and is also kind of, you know, in a way sort of weaponized as a form of espionage, you know, for espionage and blackmail, you know, by the sort of security services. And so this does kind of, you know, I mean, it feeds his disillusionment with the French Communist Party, you know, which remains loyal to the Soviet bloc, and hence with the French establishment left, which I think sort of feeds, and you know, the Communist Party is itself kind of interesting because it's both, it's, you know, it's a Communist Party, but it's also very much like of the intellectual establishment. It's sort of, you know, it's like the club you want to be part of if you're a certain kind of intellectual in this period. And so his, you know, for various reasons, I think he sees the Communist Party as kind of too normal, in the sense that it's kind of normalizing, which it was, right? I mean, there was a sense in which it was very
The
sort of
journey of
conservative in
learning,
a sense.
Yeah.
But
The Italian PC
yeah,
was very willing to indulge intellectuals. The
Right.
French was very doctrinaire
Yeah.
in some matters, and you sort of had to, the party line,
Yeah.
it was coined to describe what they were up to. But I mean, I think again, if you read my essay on the 40th anniversary, one point I try to make is how, you know, regardless of how much sympathy one might feel for, biographically for Foucault, you know, he's living in an age in which he has to sneak around to have a love life, you know, in his early, especially, that normalization and normativity are just inescapable. And I make the point that, you know, the anti-normativity discourse that Foucault in so many ways pioneered or inaugurated has become partly our institutional discourse, right? So that a kind of cheap imitation formats Foucault is just the discourse you will hear if you're a student these days, or even in my day, when you get to the dorm room, there's an initial period of like there's a kind of sexual training in dorm rooms where it's like or older RAs will come in and one is dressed like a penis and one is like a giant vagina, and they'll be like, you know, we're here to be together and be happy, but we just gotta get consent, you know, like it's sort of, you know what I'm talking about? And like, you know, and the sort of pluralizations that we inherit from a sort of Foucauldian discourse, where it's like all sexualities and knowledges are welcome here, you know. But that's become its own normalizing, you know, structure. You know, you cannot avoid it.
And because of this spreading liberties, right, that he also predicted that they'll never end.
Yes.
And you will always seek newer and newer groups to liberate.
Yes.
Because that you're kind of raison d'etre to constantly liberate somebody.
Yes.
You can't just say that we're done here.
Even the sort of institutional self-criticism that he would welcome, right, has become a mechanism for preserving institutional power. So, for example, the American Medical Association or any number of American XYZ associations will have released, especially in the past 2 years, these statements where they self-flagellate about their own role in upholding patriarchy and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, as I write in the piece, it's like kind of convenient. It's like, well, who else would be better at castigating us than us? Who knows how brutally normalizing we were than us? So that give us another chance to be anti-normative. This
Right.
I don't know.
Well, I'll say one other thing related to that, and then maybe.
Question, yeah.
But yeah, the thing that struck me, I mean, I wrote a piece that touched on these themes that was about asexuality, like what asexuality is, and I suppose the thing that kind of fascinates me is you know, it's a kind of literature that was very much of interest to Foucault. Was like, if people have ever seen Kraft Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis, which is kind of just this it's essentially sort of a catalog of perversions, right? Of, you know, all the different sort of weird kinks people have and are into. And so it is this kind of attempt to, what's up?
Illa has created this new survey.
Yeah. So, right. Well, but the thing is, and that's a good example, because I think with that and with all these other things, we see this kind of spontaneous way that people, I mean, this, you know, Foucault was interested in how the elaboration of sexuality in a modern sense is kind of connected to the production of discourse, right? And that you can't really separate these things. And so, you know, and then he traces this back to the confessional, right, as one kind of space in which this occurs. But then, you know, you have this kind of endless medical documentation, psychiatric documentation of sexualities, of proclivities, of, you know, it's this that, you know, it's initially, you know, produced as this kind of expert discourse, but then there's this kind of weird democratization of it where, you know, people are just producing this knowledge about themselves and but it's you know, it's a strange way that you know, this kind of process of liberation, you know, or you know, what is perceived as liberation through the kind of naming of your identity through these kind of discourses about sexual identities, gender identities, and so on is actually very close to, in a way that Foucault would have predicted, the kind of elaboration of discourses of power that are used to essentially, you know, sort of surveil and you know, produce knowledge which is used to exert power over the subject. So I mean,
is that quote that all philosophy is temperament? Could be also childhood memories.
My favorite example of this from Abnormal, that, you know, is going through the sort of typologies of abnormal figures that in the age of normality, right, in the aftermath of the sort of the collapse of the older classical and Christian kind of natural law and virtue ethics, you have this age that tries to define ethics around a bell curve and normality and abnormality, and he's like, of course, there's the absolute monster that the early modern age struggles with. That's the babysitter that just murders the infants in her care for like no, and how much that frustrates the judicial power, because if it was like she wanted the money of the family or something like that, then they could deal with it. Okay, we're gonna behead her or whatever, but precisely those cases where they don't have. But then it's the figure of the masturbator, which is much more common. And the funny thing is that the early modern physicians of both the individual and of society define masturbation, of course, as an abnormal behavior that was the cause of all sorts of ailments, you know, like the masturbator, like his bodily energy was sapped, his blindness and blah blah blah, and it was abnormal, and then also they believed that it was completely pervasive, right? It was abnormal and then totally normal because everyone masturbated, and therefore, you know, he describes all the ways in which you set up for like young boys, a dorm room had to be this panopticon, so that at any given night at night you could observe if they were masturbating, you know. So I just like this sort of totally abnormal and totally normal at the same time. And yeah, I mean, and in that sense, I think just to give credit to Foucault is just the absurd amount that he had absorbed in terms of just his history. Of course, in French literature, but you know, then you know, you read the second volume of the history of sexuality on the uses of pleasure, and it's just this commanding mastery of the classical literature, at least as to sex, right? It doesn't necessarily mean on everything else, but at least as to, you know, sex, he was the last of a kind of European ideal of the man who had read everything, the way Hegel had, right? Just there was not a book that he had not read, or a book that mattered to him.
I definitely want to come back to Girard, kind of as the man of the hour, and see what happened between these two gentlemen in California. But first we will go to Bruno, who has a question and who is a philosopher turned theologian and theology teacher.
Yeah, hi. I just teach down the street, St. Vincent Tower. So I have a question for you, Sohrab, regarding the project that you were discussing before. And I have to pull a few different strands together to make my question make sense. So you were saying that you were thinking that maybe this concept of normality could be a way to sneak in or bring back some sort of natural law, Aristotelian framework, which welcomes normality and kind of reasons starting from normality.
But in a different way, right? That begins from metaphysical premises. Human beings are a natural creature. Everything in nature has an end proper to it, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas this one is rather like looks at people and says, well, here's the curve of behaviors, and that's where the sweet spot lies of what most people do.
Also, is it normalcy? And Aristotle wants everybody to be excellent. Is that normal?
Yes.
He wasn't like, let's be mid.
Yes.
Just like do it sometimes.
In a way, though, it is
because virtue is
often the middle,
between
right?
two excesses.
Yeah, but I think his mean is not where other people's mean was.
Well, he then says you should get the mean and everything except for virtue. Virtue matters. But so my question is, I'm coming at this as a phenomenologist, but that's where my background is. I don't really have a horse in the race of Foucault or Aristotle, for that matter. But from my point of view, normalcy is the answer to a question. And it depends, and so what is normal depends on what question you ask. Right, so if you have a bell curve, you have a bell curve of answers to a question. You can have a bell curve of IQ, but maybe IQ is not the right question to be asked if you really want to understand whether someone is intelligent or not, whatever that means. And I think that Foucault is kind of making the same point, right? And in this, I'm learning from you more than anybody in your podcast on your series on Foucault, that Foucault wasn't really advocating for this proliferation of categories that could all be normalized so that, you know, normality could belong to everybody, but rather that he was looking for a kind of like something that is prior to the normal. And so he describes at the end of his, I don't remember which book, this ineffable kind of, you know, we could just have bodies and pleasure, and like that will be it. We don't have to worry about
That's
you know,
the
how
history of sex, volume 1.
So I'm wondering. How will you know if you're asking the right question?
Mhm.
If what you want to do is to bring back a kind of normative order that reaches back to Aristotle in some way, or to natural law in some way, maybe not reasoning from metaphysical concepts, but from observation.
Mhm.
How will you know if you're asking the right question, such that what you're getting is a normality that is kind of absolute and not question dependent?
Very good question.
What is the universal you're removing?
What is the universal? I mean, the truth is that and I will be open about this in the book, it's not sneaky, I shouldn't have used the
Once
word
again, I have to
sneaky.
let somebody in.
But I do begin with, by saying, what if the classical Christian tradition was right in, roughly speaking, defining the pillars of normality as characteristics of the organism, of the human organism, as naturally religious, as naturally social, as naturally political, and as naturally economic. So I begin with those universals as a kind of given.
I might disagree with you on the naturally economic. but-
Okay, fair enough, that's a different kind of, yeah, but that's the sort of operation of the book, and it's like, okay, well, you can tell journalistic stories, or you can tell historical stories about the degree to which, notwithstanding various attempts to overcome this kind of these normal inclinations, they've persisted. So the proposal that I sent out to HarperCollins that got me the book deal begins with the story of Islam in Central Asia. And in 1926, there were about 40,000 mosques in Central Asia. Soviets have taken over. By about a decade and a half, there are only 1,000 mosques left in Central Asia. Fast forward 6-7 decades, and the number of mosques is back on the uptick. So the argument is that, and in a way, the book, I mean, is a kind of counsel of calm to conservatives, that if we think of normal in its second valence that I mentioned, which is the ortho, at the right angle, the right way to do things, and you think that has that there's some nexus between that version of normal and nature, then you have to relax it. It's not so easily sort of wiped away, right? It's not so easily overcome. And I still tell similar stories about attempts, and here I draw on Lash, early 19th century through the 20th century sociology. So much of it was concerned with, do we really need this mode of family that society has prized for so long? And then, even fast forwarding from Lash's time, it's still remarkably durable. So that's the kind of my operation is I sort of assume that let's pretend for sake of argument that what the classical tradition says is normal in that enduring, genuinely normative way, rather than just a bell curve way, is correct, and then test it against history in key cases. So I make a historical and journalistic response to your question is first make an assumption that they were right about their universals, and then to try to tell stories about the degree to which these at least these kind of 3 or 4, I know you didn't like the economic one, but have endured through the ages.
Okay. I don't want to monopolize things.
Okay,
I will.
we can chat afterwards.
Yeah, I'll follow.
Any other questions right now? If not, I'm going to jump into René. Should I have anything else? We could not find 2 French men who disagree more than these 2 guys, and yet. So what is the
Yeah, so I'll try to be brief. So
This is when
the,
they are both in California.
no, it's actually earlier,
Okay,
so
so no, like, strolls on the
Girard
beach.
is, so it's interesting, right, they do end up both in California in the early eighties. But their main encounters happen in Buffalo, of all places, in the early seventies. So Buffalo, I mean, University of Buffalo is a extremely interesting place at that time. It has a, I don't know, a lot of people are gathered there who, you know, you'd be surprised how many sort of fascinating intellectuals come together at that university in particular. But so Girard is brought there from Hopkins, you know, and it's a university, it's a newish state university. There is kind of a desire to, you know, it's a moment of intellectual, and I mean, I've written about this in relation to Girard, right? It's a moment when, you know, intellectual paradigms are being questioned, and there is a premium placed on people, on intellectuals who can offer or seem to be attempting to offer some new paradigm that will replace the old fusty ones that, you know, students are not interested in anymore, and that don't seem to be, you know, particularly relevant to the rapid sort of, you know, social and political transformations underway. So this is a time when, you know, you can really make it big on coming up with grand theories. And so all these European, you know, maybe French in particular, intellectuals are kind of brought over as part of that. The Hopkins conference organized in '66 that Girard is one of the organizers of. Foucault is supposed to come to it, but ends up not coming. But, you know, various other people, Derrida and Lacan and various other people show up to that, and it's sort of the, you know, the start of this invasion of French theory. But okay, so fast forwarding a bit, you know, Buffalo, it's kind of another space where there's an attempt to like incubate these new lines of thinking. Girard is brought there and really given free rein. You know, it's just one of these things, if you've tried to be an academic in America and our time, you know, it sort of makes you frustrated and nostalgic for this time when, like, I don't know, you would just be kind of given free rein to like teach whatever you wanted, write books about whatever you wanted. Lots of funding and so on. But so he gets that, and then, you know, as part of this, he also is part of a committee that brings over notable intellectuals from the continent, and Foucault is one of them. So Foucault comes over and gives us a number of lectures in Buffalo at this time, and this seems to be the main period in which they interacted. So this is the period when Girard is writing Violence and the Sacred, Foucault is writing what will become Discipline and Punish. And he so they, and these books do have some interesting kind of points of convergence. I mean, they're essentially about how societies regulate violence in you know, from very different approaches and looking at different historical periods. But they're both very interested in the Dionysian, they're both interested in Nietzsche, and they're both, you know, so I believe Girard is giving lectures on Euripides, gives a series of lectures on Euripides' Bacchae that Foucault attends, and they have some discussions about that. So there are these kind of fascinating interactions between them. Unfortunately, most of these are unrecorded, like there's no transcript of them. So there are a few letters between them in this period. And we know that Foucault does appreciate Violence and the Sacred because he writes a letter praising it immediately after it's published. And
they both have
this
this
is,
sense, right, that
yeah.
underneath the veneer of civilization, there is this
yeah,
dark chaos.
yes, exactly.
And every once in a while it just pops up, whether, and somehow that in individualism, it's a little bit more, even more uncontrollable because we pretend it's not there.
Yes,
Whereas
and
like old systems, they knew it was there and kind of openly control it.
yes, and I mean, I think it's also important that, you know, this is a period where so there's a term, a phrase in Violence and the Sacred that's the festival gone wrong, you know, which is essentially this idea of like a, you know, a sort of carnivalesque type of, you know, outpouring of these sort of illicit energies, and then these can be kind of channeled in, you know, more or less acceptable ways through certain social forms, but then sometimes this can go awry, and so that's kind of what you get in in Euripides, the Bacchae. But you know,
like
you
the
can
ending of
arguably
the first kill,
it's also
right, when they eat the guy, like the party one was too good.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so but the other thing that you get is actually the kind of aftermath of 1968, where you get, you know, this kind of carnivalesque experience of the 68 uprising, but then really, you know, you have the young European left kind of spiraling into violence, terrorism. And then in 1972, which is the year of the publication of Violence in the Sacred, and it's a year when, so Foucault is in Buffalo that year. And again, this is all kind of archival stuff that only came out in this recent biography of Girard, you know, which is about 1,000 pages long. But basically, they interact, and this actually happens to be the time that Foucault is kind of having these dialogues with these Maoists I mentioned before, and they're kind of like, okay, maybe we should just like go lynch people. So Girard writes Violence in the Sacred, which is really about, you know, it's essentially a kind of anthropology of lynching and of the lynch mob, is one way of thinking about it. And so it's fascinating that, you know, Foucault reads this book precisely at this moment when he's having these dialogues about what's referred to as popular justice. There's even a case in a small French town in this exact year, like literally it would have been within the month that Violence in the Sacred is published, where there's a murder of a young girl who like works at a factory, and then this sort of bourgeois lawyer, I believe, is accused of having raped and murdered her. So there's controversy about this, and these, you know, these Maoists are basically like arguing for the need to just go and lynch this guy who's accused of this. And Foucault sort of has this dialogue with these people. He goes to the town, but he doesn't ever make any public statements about it. And in the end, they don't. In the end, they don't do it.
They actually go to the town. I want to see that.
In the end, they don't do it, but then there is another incident. There's a factory where there's a protest where I think a worker is killed by a policeman or a security guard around a strike at a factory. And after this, some of these Maoists kidnap a manager, like a, you know, executive from the factory. But unlike what happens in Italy and Germany in the same period, where a number of, you know, high-profile politicians and businessmen are kidnapped and murdered by sort of you know, Marxist radicals, the French students end up releasing him unharmed, and so in the end the sort of there is really a sense that there's a threat of this kind of direct action that's being and terrorism that's being undertaken by the Red Army factions in other countries is about to happen in France, and then for various reasons it kind of doesn't. It never takes quite the path it does with like Baader-Meinhof in Germany. And so, you know, it's just really interesting because this year of 1972, you know, the sort of culminating moment of which is probably the Munich Olympics massacre, and that, you know, this is like the moment when Girard and Foucault are kind of having these dialogues about, you know, lynching and the penal system and the judicial system and, you know, the Dionysian and its relation to violence. So it's
that he kind of ended up indirectly inventing cancel culture.
Well, I mean, you know, I think
I
think Foucault, I mean, I would say he, you know, the cancel culture it's definitely happening in that realm of this kind of ideological purity policing of the French left.
ideological lynching.
And in some ways, he's kind of trying to avoid falling afoul of it himself, I think. And then interestingly, you know, that after this particular moment of ferment, it seems that there's sort of a gradual winding down of a lot of these energies. A lot of, you know, this is where you get the rise of the new philosophers, you know, some of whom, you know, Bernard-Henri Lévy, who's still, you know, swanning around the world, sort of, you know, and these are but these guys are, you know, they're basically kind of like the neocons, right? They're these ex-leftists who become disillusioned with the left. And so, you know, and they're kind of part of this whole story. So it's really this moment when left-wing violence, you know, the kind of, you know, more carnivalesque energies of 68 are taking this much darker turn. There's this kind of explosion of left-wing violence in some contexts. In
I mean,
France, it
right,
kind of
right,
peters out.
violence as well,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So like, let's not forget that during this time, there's plenty
Well,
of fascist activity
I
in
mean,
Western Europe, racist attacks, etc., etc. So that's like one, it's not like, oh, the world kind of bloomed into leftist violence, it was like,
Well, I mean,
kind
in France, you would say the moment of that was a bit earlier around the Algerian war and
it's
the.
ongoing.
That you have but I mean, the really key moments of
Yeah.
kind of right-wing terrorism were at that earlier moment around the withdrawal from Algeria and so on, and we're very very dominant as well. But I don't know, it's this moment where there's a sense that things are unraveling, that there's a kind of sense that the post-war political and social order is beginning to really kind of show its cracks. And so it's striking to me that they converge at this moment, and I think are both very much thinking about that problem in very different ways. And yeah, and honestly, like
An unlikely friendship.
yeah, but and they didn't, they sort of had a number of encounters, but it was never, nothing ever came of it in terms of any kind of published correspondence or public exchange. So most of our knowledge of it comes from a few letters and a couple of reminiscences by people who were in Buffalo, and also at certain times they encountered each other in Paris as well. So they're kind of people who have secondhand accounts of their conversations, but that's about all there is to go on. But anyway, I do have this paper coming out about that, which will come out sometime. But if people are interested in reading it, I can also share the draft of it.
Any big Girardian here wants to add a point? We kind of attracted the Foucauldians today.
Yeah. So yeah, what else? Who's
What's the influence of Althusser on Foucault? Because Althusser plays like a huge, I think that's it, right?
yeah.
He plays a huge role in the '68 revolts or whatever the hell, May '68, whatever.
Do you want to just repeat the question?
Yeah, Althusser. So he's an older figure. He's kind of a
Super popular.
he's more of an eminence.
Yeah.
Already, whereas I think Foucault is kind of more on the rise at this point. And he is, he's a party man, he's a Communist Party
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
guy, and I think Foucault is, I mean, he does. I believe he's Foucault's teacher at one point. Like Foucault has him as a teacher. Like literally is in his class, and I think he's not. There's certainly a lot that could be. There's a lot that could be Althusser's account of like ideological state apparatuses and so on. His interest in how kind of power operates at the level of say at this kind of more diffuse level, right, of all of these apparatuses, the school, the family, etc. And that there's clearly a kind of shared interest in, again, the kind of diffusion of power, like outside of the operations of the sort of direct operations of the state, or of like the repressive state apparatus, and the way that I mean, the repressive state apparatus, one would be the prison, which Foucault is very interested in. But I think Foucault was in some ways maybe less. I mean, he wasn't particularly interested in thinking about ideology, it's just not a term that he uses very much, and I think that speaks to his kind of not wanting to be within the Marxian paradigm, not wanting to operate within the Marxian paradigm, but also being more interested in this, what he calls microphysics of power. So kind of taking us out of like the theater of the mind, ideology is something that's kind of happening inside your head. He's much more interested in, again, this kind of microphysics, the way that it's sort of operating physically, in the bot, like, and this is honestly where, if you want to blame Foucault for something, it's like, all this annoying talk of like bodies and people saying like, oh, the body this, the body that, or like, I don't know whether, to dunk on somebody who's been controversial recently, like, I don't know exactly where like Ta-Nehisi Coates's, you know, where he'll just say, instead of saying like, you know, I don't know,
Black
African Americans or black
He'll
people or
say
whatever,
black
he'll say black
bodies.
bodies, right, or
That
the
is,
black
that is
body.
a Foucault, yeah.
And so like that is a kind of a reflection of this Foucauldian you know, kind of approach where you're thinking about the microphysics of power, like the way the power operates directly on the body, as opposed to this more kind of ideological set of operations. So I mean, that's probably one way that they sort of diverge, even though in a sense they're both kind of interested in the same set of phenomena.
Well, so,
And you know, there are better answers to this, and there are people who have written extensively about this. I'm just you know,
Well, how do you
I
explain
don't have
like
the references offhand.
well, no, it's okay. I mean, how do you explain the relationship between Foucauldianism, if that's the right way to say that, and Maoism? Because there seems to be like an overlap. You're already kind of alluding to it.
And Maoism?
Yeah, Maoism. Because as you said, it's not, you know, Foucault wasn't necessarily a Marxist, but there seems to be a very distinct overlap both in people that observed movements historically and at the time with Maoism.
Yeah,
I think the distance, the relation is pretty attenuated, actually, it's, other than that was in the air. Maoism was in the
Right, just
air.
the time period.
Part of the French
Traction.
left and part of the European left at the time was this fascination with, you know, third world uprisings, third worldism. Maoism itself is a
Yeah.
sort of tendency within Marxism that may have been more promising than the various routes that have been traversed up to that point.
And they didn't yet know what happened, right? I mean, we know it in retrospect.
Yeah, or it was
Like in the
unfolding in real time,
mid-60s,
yes, yes. So,
people,
but
yeah,
Foucault himself, I don't see much of a Maoist, other than just the sort of temporal.
but yeah, I mean, you know, I think you know, in this like particular context of sort of French intellectual life, I think you sort of have to understand the Maoism partly as a kind of Oedipal revolt against the Communist Party, where you know that there's the Sino-Soviet split, and you know, being on one hand, the Communist Party is kind of the club you want to join if you want to be part of the intellectual elite. But then, of course, you know, because it becomes so much the establishment, it ends up being something you want to kind of rebel against. And so, particularly in '68, when you have a rejection of, you know, I mean, it's interesting if you compare it to say like Occupy or something like that, like. You know, there's a rejection of the sort of electoral approach, like the the sort of, you know, the Communist Party was happy to accommodate itself to the kind of political institutions of French life, to be part of the labor union, sort of establishment, to, you know, to be a party that would, you know, potentially sort of, as it eventually did, you know, become part of a governing coalition with the Socialist Party. So like it's definitely the establishment, and so if you want to be anti-establishment, you know, Maoism is kind of the best option,
Yeah,
and then at the same time, it's like, you know, it seems to, I mean, it's, you know, the Cultural Revolution in this period is perceived as a youth movement. It's perceived as a movement of the youth against these kind of stodgy old people and sort of institutions and structures, and so. You know, it's very appealing in that way, and I think Foucault, you know, he never likes you know, he's pretty disillusioned with and critical of the sort of Communist Party established, you know, aligned intellectual establishment in France from pretty early on. He doesn't like the Eastern Bloc from what he's seen of it. He doesn't think it's at all something to aspire to. So I think briefly, even though he's not, you know, I don't think he never identifies as a Maoist, but he sees the kind of you know, I think this kind of more kind of voluntarist, like spontaneous, kind of youthful quality of it seems to him sort of salutary in comparison with the more kind of establishment left.
Wasn't Pol Pot, a crappy French university student? He was part of like the whole communist scene.
Yeah, I mean, he did study in Paris, but yeah, I don't know.
Roughly same time period.
Yeah, when was he there? I'm not sure.
I think it's roughly been like May '68.
Yeah,
Same time period.
And the Ayatollah Khomeini was in there.
That's right.
Really?
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Which the Iranian Revolution coincides with the lecture you were mentioning almost.
Yeah,
does,
that's right.
yeah.
Yeah,
But it's interesting, the extent to which Foucault is not interested in the category of class in the way that Orthodox Marxism is. And when, you know, when he describes what the future to come in which class is completely transcendent because each person is an individual human capital, I'm not entirely sure that Foucault reviles the picture of the world, I mean, that he's actually rejecting it per se. I'm not sure he's even opposed to it at all, right? Like, it's not necessarily a critical account, but he does say, I mean, you know, beware of this world to come, it's a breaking world or something a little bit, but that's not his phrase, but what I'm trying to say is I think there is something to Orthodox, when Orthodox Marxists write about Foucault as the person who shifted the left's locus of activism away from the realm of production and of class conflict and so on toward emancipating marginalized identities or emancipating and marginalized sexualities and so on. I think there is something to that.
Like the identity group.
Yeah, I hate to say identity politics because I don't think it's appropriate. But I don't think that's appropriate to say identity politics for people, but to say that that, you know, the emancipation of just the marginal, which isn't necessarily what is marginal doesn't necessarily correspond with what is assetless.
and I mean, there is also a kind of libertarian, I don't know, there's a libertarian dimension of Foucault, right?
It comes out in that lecture.
Yeah, and I mean, he does, you know, when he's describing, you know, the work of like Chicago economists like Gary Becker, you know, he's like pretty appreciative of them, and you know, there's a way in which he sees something positive about, you know, the end of the sort of mid-century welfare state and something like potentially emancipatory in that. He's like pretty, you know, he seems to kind of like the neoliberal economists.
But
and
correctly, and this is the remarkable thing, he says, if you follow the neoliberals, if you follow their line of thinking, you know, it's not that you're going to get rid of the welfare state, it's that you're going to push toward universal basic income.
right.
Just enough to get people that are
Right.
like the useless eaters to just not be,
Right.
to stabilize them or whatever, and some share of them.
They're
will
putting the
eventually-
radicals into one campus.
Yeah.
So Foucault is he would have been an Andrew Yang supporter.
Yes. No, I mean,
He would have been Yang Yang.
yeah, I don't know how much he supported XYZ policy, but it's remarkable in the way he said that the direction will be. He doesn't use the word universal basic income. He uses the negative income tax, which is similar to universal,
And that is how Friedman talked about.
yes,
it.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. It's like that's the future of Western capitalism.
But it is fascinating in this kind of 70, you know, people often cite 79 as the sort of birth of neoliberalism moment, and he is, you know, both fascinated by the Ayatollahs and the Iranian Revolution, and he's fascinated by the neoliberals and Chicago.
That's really containing multitude.
Yeah, but it's like he does see something about where the world is going. But and then I mean his interest in the Iranian Revolution is, you know, I think it is of a piece, you know, he is kind of you know, he is searching for direction, you know, sort of political directions, and he never you know, and so he has this kind of brief flirtation with the Maoists. But it doesn't last more than a sort of year or two. Then he's involved in these kind of, you know, he's interested in this more kind of concrete politics of, you know, this this sort of prison, you know, this I can't remember what it's called, like prison research group or something like that, that he's, you know, one of the instigators of, where, you know, it's really a much more focused kind of politics. It's not an overall kind of emancipatory project, and it's not, you know, unlike certain trends on the left that would be connected to it's not sort of some kind of like, you know, prison abolition is a you know, decolonial queer issue or something. It's much more like we have to understand this very particular thing and specific mechanisms by which it works. And you know, and so he's interested in that that kind of concreteness and specificity. But then I think with the Iranian Revolution, as briefly with the Maoists, he's kind of fascinated by, and you know, this goes back to normality in a sense, like he's throughout his life fascinated by the limit experience, right? And what are the spaces in which you can find limit experiences? And I think he's interested in politics as a space for limit experiences, and he seems to only be interested in political action in this way, and when it offers something like this. So in other words, he's not interested in whatever sort of, I guess what we would think of as like being a participant in a broader kind of emancipatory project. What he's interested in these particular political moments that become opportunities for limit experience, and in that way are similar to, you know, sex, drugs, literature, all these other kinds of things. And so he does, you know, what he appreciates about the Iranian Revolution is this kind of strange sort of spiritual fervor of it.
I can just hear like my, because I'm Iranian, was born there, and I can just hear my grandmother being like, he can show his living experience.
Yeah.
But is there,
You can have it.
so probably a lot of people on the left in America don't really know about this bad curiosity of Foucault's, where he kind of semi-embraced neoliberalism, but would a way to deal with the kind of overreach is committed these days in his name. One of the solutions proposed is to return to the Aristotelian virtue, the normal, because I mean, virtue ethics is also not a collectivist ethics, right? It's about individual. No?
Can I ask a question?
You have a question?
Yeah, because it's about like two things. Like one is, I would love for you guys to. I'm not a Foucault guy, but I would love for you guys to talk about the Foucault and truth, because the the cliche today that all this stuff about truth and regimes of truth and all this language also that the kids are talking somehow came from Foucault. Truth is
Knowledge power.
Yeah, and it's like I don't even understand what he means by power. Sometimes I think about like what the truth is what you speak to power. I don't understand what he means, but like I really want to understand that. And the question is, because I remember seeing a YouTube clip where one Foucault said, "Who's your biggest influence?" And he said Heidegger and Nietzsche, but ultimately Nietzsche.
Oh.
And when it comes to truth, that's significant.
Yeah.
So for Heidegger, truth is a very different thing than for Nietzsche and for Foucault. And so that's one thing I would love to understand, like, is it real that it came from that? And second, is there a place, apropos ethics, is there a place in Foucault where he believes or he accepts where we are subject to a judgment that transcends the horizon of the social? You know what I mean? Are we always in the social, or is there a place where we are transcending it in some ways? Is there a place?
Girardian question.
Yes.
Okay, so virtue, truth, individual, transcending the mimetic desire. Just small questions.
Yeah.
Just like
I mean,
epilogue.
if you'd like my essay, we could, so the thing that pleased me the most about this essay, which is a work of a I'm a journalist, so but I had lots of associate professors of people who teach Foucault email me and say, this is the best primer I've encountered for like for students to read of just so like what are the basics of Foucault. And I think on the judgment I come down on the piece is not really a polemical piece. I try to be mostly sort of expository, but that there is something to the so his fundamental operation is what I would describe as a kind of scholars have described as like a kind of radical nominalism. It begins with the premise that it's not even historicism, right? He said in the Birth by Politics and elsewhere, he says, don't call me a historicist, because what a historicist does is take a universal like truth, beauty, blah, 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 and put it through the rigors of history and show you the extent to which historical contingency has contoured this thing that people take to be universal. And he says, my project is not historicism, it's rather to pretend that the universals don't even exist. to begin by the assumption that none of the universals exist, and then to examine how they've operated in institutions and in kind of creating these
How they become.
these concatenations. He uses the term like institutional concatenation that govern people. You know, and that they use these universals like monstrosity, perversion, madness, you know,
Freedom.
truth, free, etc., to govern. And you know, at the core of that is, I would say, ultimately there is a denial of truth as.
So it's only the
Social.
direction of the social, it's all, there's
No, he's
nothing.
denying it, no, like he's saying that, I mean, I loved your distinction between the be and the become.
Mhm.
That these are not axiomatic statements like you would have in the natural world that you can reliably build a house on. These are I mean, memes in some sense that appear, they work for whatever utility. And then we build on it so much that eventually you build on the build on the build on the build. And he's like, okay, what if the actual core is not there?
And so to try to give give an example of this, in the second volume of the History of Sexuality is concerned with, you know, the ancient Greek sexual ethic. And I have to say, I mean, he holds his own judgments so close to, you know, so he veils them so much that but you can tell that he admires the Greek way of sexuality. He says, you know, it's not about what particular act is necessarily in tune with some revealed truth, which is, of course, comes with like the Decalogue, you know, with Judeo-Christian morality, but rather whether or not it's good for the organism and in what amount is more important than what the act is. So like, you know, that the person who is has that degree of self-mastery, he doesn't engage in too much X, Y, or Z act, knowing that going too far will and then he comes to a point where he says, okay, that at some point that can come, you know, that can lead to a complete self-denial, and that's the Platonic kind of ideal, which he explores toward the end of the book. But it's not for the same reason as the Judeo-Christian person refrains from certain sexual acts altogether and says the sexual acts must only be limited to marriage. Rather, it's this sort of the will to self-mastery. It's just a completely different ethical quality. And so again, I can't help but read that as a Christian and sort of
I mean, they didn't have it.
at some level it repels me, but
they didn't have at their kind of epistemological disposal a set of rules that Judeo-Christian thinkers do have, right? I mean,
well, no, they did have a set of rules, but the rules were just ordered to different ends and in a completely different worldview. You know, it's just about it's this kind of
all you have is the self.
this taking care of the self, and like just in the same way that like
How we do it
twice a
today.
year you should purge, you know, like you should eat but too much and purge and whatever. So also, you know, there's a season for having a boy, and then a boy grows up, and then at that beyond that point.
It's like self-help articles today. They do exactly this, right? They don't moralize. They're like, too much of this is bad for you, bad for your health. Your Oura ring will beep. You know, stop doing that.
It's an Oura ring. You should get one of those.
Aristotle also had Dr. Son, you know Foucault. So that's Dr. Son tend to reject universals. It's an interesting point.
But I think in Foucault you can't really transcend. In Girard you can, right? So there's the religion where you can step out of the.
So, I mean, I kind of want to dig up just a passage in this piece that I just finished that I was discussing earlier, because it sort of touches on this, and it's a comment that Girard made after Foucault's death, kind of about what he took from him, but also what he, you know, where he diverged from him. So without getting too deep into it, he says, So Girard, speaking about Foucault, he says it's Foucault's pessimism that separates us. Unlike him, I think historical processes have meaning and that we have to accept this or else we face utter despair. And further notes, after the end of ideologies, the only way to embrace this meaning is to rediscover religion. So, something I think is kind of fascinating, which I touch on in the paper, is that he's again at the beginning of this paper. I'm talking about Foucault's dialogue with Benny Levy, who's one of these the sort of most significant sort of of these like Maoist radicals, very, very influential in this period. And interestingly, he himself, he's like really, sort of pushing Foucault or along with Foucault, kind of going in this direction of essentially condoning like quite extreme political violence and so on. Anyway, Levy himself, interestingly, like returns to Orthodox Judaism like towards the end of the 70s.
It's very Hegelian,
Like around this time, but
and
then he describes this as going from Mao to Moses. But so it's an interesting kind of confirmation of, in some sense, him having a similar insight to the one that Girard says, which is, if you follow this Foucauldian path, okay, I guess in the end, maybe you flirt with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, but then he kind of, and then Foucault's own.
I mean, Foucault died so young, whereas
He died young, but
he
he
don't know
right.
what that
He did.
happened in the last 30 years of his life.
Yes.
Whether he would have kind of grounded himself on materialism forever, or he would have found a way to transcend.
Right, which then there's, that his also, his quest, of course, takes him to Death Valley, dropping LSD in his final years, as well as, really the way he kind of describes his participation in the sort of bathhouse scene of San Francisco in this period is again through this kind of lived experience language. So there is something, kind of quasi-religious or, something close to it about Foucault's kind of quest for experience, but it is ultimately a quest for experience, and therefore,
That's an experience he brought from Heidegger and Jaspers. I think that was their battle cry in the early 20s. It was like death, guilt, all that stuff was about limit experience. It's like you have the everyday life, and then you actually measure it by the limit experience. And I think it took it from Jaspers was also very
My friend Patrick Deneen, who's an appreciative artist, reader of, says he was always searching for a freedom that liberalism couldn't give. So it's always that kind of but I always see this as almost like a kind of
it's the big quest of our time, right?
The Hellraiser kind of account. It's this kind of extreme. When I hear lived experience, and when I think of it in a Foucauldian context, I do think of like the bathhouse in hell.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, no, Hellraiser is it's kind of the perfect movie for pairing with some of Foucault.
We should have brought us
Let's
follow this up
let's
with a
just film
screen.
club next time. Let's just but searching for freedom that liberalism can't give sounds like the big question of 2024, right? That's the question. Yeah.
Question over here.
Any questions in the room?
So I think the main contribution of Foucault, I think, is definitely around the microphysics of power. What I found always not very satisfying, that never came up with a normative theory of power. So my question is, do you think there is a way to build upon Foucault to develop a normative theory of power, or is the problem that power is an almost ontological category in Foucault that you actually can't get to that point? What's your take?
One would be
the question, so just
can you use Foucault to, if I'm understanding, to develop a normative account of power? One thing that is part of this book, and when you're at this early stage in the book, you can talk about it because it's all kind of loose, but to redeem power, to redeem coercion, you have to recover the old distinction between power and authority, between, I really don't think Foucault was capable of that. He just did not see that distinction at all. So that when he any authority he encountered, he just saw some disciplinary or controlling power. And but you know, you think about Canguilhem, and so it's like, well, okay, he says, he's like, when physicians talk about normalization, his point is that they're deploying categories that implicate power and, you know, social differences. And so this thing, let's be honest, when a doctor says normal, it's not, you know, again, that distribution, there is a sort of judgment built into it, and that's bad if you think that there is no distinction between power and authority. But if you think that, you know, authority rightly understood is what occasionally uses coercive mechanisms to help us become who we're meant to be, given our name. Now I'm just becoming an Aristotelian, but like if that's how you conceive of authority, then normalization isn't such a dirty word. It isn't such a bad thing. So like, yeah, in my outline of the book, the second half of the book is like, how do we restore? I argue that actually America's processes of normalization have in places ground to a halt. In other words, it doesn't matter what the norm is, we cannot normalize people according to it's partly because of like the collapse of the paternal function, I argue. It's partly because it's partly because of the collapse of what I call traditional psychiatry, by which I mean the kind of Freudian voices. Look, sorry, like this is how society is. You have to come to terms with its various repressions. It's the fact that we actually don't have a mass media. Mass media has this great normalizing capacity because you see a world out there, and then there's a kind of self-reflection of like, well, that's how people are supposed to be. What am I? You kind of come into this, and so on and so forth. And in each of these cases, I think our systems for normalization have broken down, and so I call for, you know, will argue for shoring them up. But that the premise there is that authority is not necessarily it doesn't have this sort of void of legitimacy that I think in the Foucauldian telling exists in all authority. It's all just power.
I mean, but you also talk about in your primer on Foucault, and that's why the masturbation versus nanny example is so good. And you know, I grew up during the last years of a totalitarian regime, and I remember these
In the goulash years, though.
well, yeah, that these instances of power, when like the nanny in this case is an employee, right? But because there's sin, there's the abnormal, suddenly this nobody in that structure is powerful. And this is like, if you read any account of really, really messed up panopticon type totalitarian regimes, including what's currently going on in Hungary, you have anybody gets this moment of power. And but that's why cancel culture is so tragic, right? Because it's bringing this to the West. When, oh, I found your old tweet or whatever. And this Anon with an anime account now has some power over your career and family and whatever. It's kind of insane. Don't look at my old tweets.
Yeah, I mean, a few things, you know, I think the libertarian kind of reading of, I mean, it's funny, like Nick Gillespie, who, you know, we both like had positive and very interesting libertarian writer to follow and, you know, listen to his interviews and podcasts. But he is he is actually a big Foucault fan and a noted libertarian about town. But in any case, you know, so there are libertarians who recognize Foucault as one of them in some sense. But I think, yeah, just he's a kind of instinctual libertarian, and there's a way in which his you know, his kind of just dogged opposition to norms and normalization, you know, it makes a lot of sense in the moments in which he emerged, and specifically in the France, in which he emerged, which, was in a ways, in many ways a highly sort of regimented and hierarchical society. One that, and I mean, what is in many ways one that we can, for different reasons kind of look back to with nostalgia, but for its sort of prosperity, for its, I mean, widely shared prosperity and so on, but, could be experienced, particularly if you were, say, gay, like as quite stifling and oppressive. And so, I think he that sort of impetus of his thought and its appeal makes a lot of sense. And say just like, his sort of seeming hostility to like the welfare state, right? And to kind of, social democracy, which would seem to be kind of at odds with his reputation as a figure of the left, but that was in a sense the establishment he was rejecting, and and so I think when he comes over to the United States, the valences of that somewhat, I mean, they carry over somewhat, right? We did have a kind of countercultural revolt, which was sort of anti-statist and had these kind of libertarian dimensions, but there's a sense in which he's also kind of in tune with a certain American, a kind of deeper American sort of libertarian spirit, and which I would say he is a much more fundamentally countercultural one in the French context, but could be sort of absorbed into the American cultural sphere in an unexpected way.
A dialogue that hasn't been staged is Lash Foucault. I think Lash has this, it comes from this kind of left libertarian suspicion of the post-war administrative structures, welfare structures, and how they sort of
Well, he reviews a couple of Foucault's books
in mainstream places.
Yeah.
I mean, Hegel had a very good normative description of authority, and if we're looking for a primer, I really recommend Richard Sennon's book, which is titled Authority, just to avoid any confusion. Hannah Arendt's disciple. Maybe we'll do a conversation on Hegel at some point. And you had that question.
Yeah, actually, on that, I wonder if there are times that you feel like Foucault has a point, right? Like he's one of the few French leftists during that time that has an antibody within him. Authoritarian, right? Before, all fell for, and now we're here. And it's precisely because of sensitivity to power and does not believe that there could be powerless authority that maybe made him that way. So I wonder what you think about that, and on top of that, okay, what can be that power-free authority? Right, like you read Simone Weil talks about the need for submission, right? And there is, you can understand that, but what do people submit to that's not because of some sort of power structure?
It's by the attention, what Hegel said. Adrian?
So on the point, where do you like agree with them or whatever? I mean, again, like the essay I wrote and even the much deeper engagement that will be presented in the book is full of praise for his kind of micro analysis of power. And I do think, I mean, like with this, like the birth of the normal in the 19th century, by the way, the word in the 19th century, it was only in the mid-20th century when we started to say he's a normal person, and it was kind of became a sociological category. In the 19th century, it was almost exclusively medical. There's a physician named Broussais who first tried to define the normal and pathological states, and he thought of he basically said there is no distinction, there's no ontological distinction between them, that the pathological state is just an intensification or a deficiency away from the normal. And he basically his solution to everything was to basically bleed the patient. And he was famous for his
Deficiency.
He was famous for his use of leeches.
Oh.
And he was by name, but also not by name, in some cases not by name, repeatedly mocked in various it's a butt of Balzac's jokes. And Ian Hacking, great sort of intellectual historian of normality, says that probably the way we use normal today was basically popularized by Balzac.
Mocking this guy.
Poussin. And anyway, so in all of this, when Foucault is critiquing the sort of brute processes of early modern normalization, you can't but be sympathetic, right? Like this kind of, with this industrial society has arisen that has actually, you know, far less room for people to be, you know, just different and a little bit fun, you know, it brutally says like, that's normal, that's abnormal. I think that critique has a lot of validity to my mind, so it's just to be clear. Oh, I forgot your second half of your question,
Can't.
Okay.
How do we
Powerless
imagine
over.
power free?
I'm free for it. Gender, but
yeah, I can't because I turn here to, again, Aristotle, which the best summary of it you find in St. Thomas's treatise on law. And he says, you know, exhortations to virtue are nice, exhortations to virtue are good, but they're inefficacious because they lack the sort of disciplinary power to say that. But if you think that there's a legible human good to, you know, and any parent knows this, that is true for, you know, not just for individuals, but for a society, then the application of coercive authority to try to bring people, you know, to make more social choices and be less antisocial, to, you know, at the level of the child, to like not stick his finger in a socket. If you think that that's true, then you don't recoil from the fact that loving authority can have a disciplinary or coercive component. Foucault would, yeah.
What about Jesus?
what about Jesus?
What about
No, as powerless authority.
Ah, yes.
There is this kenosis.
Sure.
It wasn't just like, what about Jesus? Like, let's talk about
WWJD, yeah, no, that's there, but I would just say that, you know, somehow historic Christianity took the message of powerless powerless authority, and nevertheless, in order to impart and socialize it, was, you know, perfectly willing to sort of encompass civilization, to work with authority. I mean, certainly after the Constantinian conversion, that the religion became a mass religion once it was no longer just something that was fit for a kind of spiritual elite that could tolerate any martyrdom, any pressure, but rather, you know, for ordinary people, in which it was part of it became cultural, it became structural. So I mean, insofar as that's been the development of historic Christianity, I can't look back on it and say that that's the betrayal of the message of the cross.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think the left really likes about Christianity, that there is this kind of inherent revolutionary nature to the cross, to martyrdom, but these all at the same time seem like things that just cannot be integrated into a structure. Like you can't have a structure of martyrdom, you can't have a ministry of martyrdom, right?
Yeah.
Like it's, and so like this idea of a powerless authority maybe necessarily needs to be outside of the social and the structure and the mass, and can only be the exception.
That's where we can imagine it, yeah.
Outside of the church.
Or in a early Franciscans, right? In their
Or Tezing. But
Yeah, like
So
it always has to be tamed at a certain
And it
point.
does.
That's what happened with Francis, right?
I mean, bureaucracies, technologies frequently try these experiments. You have the EU, right, with a bunch of unelected, faceless people making decisions for an entire continent. You have the AGI fairs, you have crypto, right?
Not come here for Europhobic disinformation, right? I'm kidding, I'm kidding.
You know, you can post it in tweets that was there. What's interesting to me is like when we look at Foucault and we contrast it with Girard, we contrast it with Hegel, with Aristotle, we see these different takes on how centralized or decentralized power should be. And the fact of the matter, if you actually historicize, is that every era seems to have one functioning level of centralization that works for that amount of people, that level of whatever, religiosity, social progress, and we kind of have to try until we were like find that. But Foucault doesn't seem a very centralizing person, so to me, so maybe he is a.
What would you have thought of the blockchain?
He would have loved it. He would have loved it.
He'd been just a crypto bro.
Yeah.
Gang, crypto.
Adrienne, if you're watching this, we are giving you Foucault. Whether you want him or not. Guys, thank you so much for being here. There will be some refreshments outside. We can continue our discussion there. This was a joy. I learned so much, and now I'm going to go and order 75 books as usual after an interact conversation. We don't yet have an Amazon discount scheme, but we're working on it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.